A Bullet for Barbara by Anthony Darder. Chapter 1. I smelled the fresh pine before the sun even cleared the roofline of the alley. The Los Angeles sun was already beating down hard and bone dry, the kind of heat that bakes the old motor oil right out of the asphalt and leaves a metallic tang in the back of your throat. On a morning like this, the heavy humidity off the coast usually had Joe Russo reaching for the cane he kept by the office door. A bitter reminder of the slug he took to the thigh a while back. But today, the skies were clear, the air was light, and Joe was moving as smooth as a high society grifter, his limp completely gone, as he carried a length of baseboard into the shade of the open garage. I leaned against the corner of the workbench, a paintbrush balanced loosely in my hand, watching the two of them. After the relentless, blood-soaked fallout we had just survived up on Bunker Hill, my mind was still adjusting to the quiet. In our line of work, a peaceful morning usually just meant the fuse was burning somewhere out of sight. But for now, the only battle being fought was between Paulie and a sheet of plasterboard. The garage wasn't a garage anymore. Paulie had spent the last 3 weeks hammering, sawing, and cursing it into a miniature, self-contained apartment. He slammed a heavy metal toolbox shut with an aggressive clatter that echoed off the new rafters, wiping a grease-stained rag across his glistening forehead. He looked around the small space, his jaw clamped tight enough to crack a tooth. "At least I get the old bat out of the house," Paulie grumbled, tossing the rag onto a notched sawhorse with entirely too much force. "I just wish I didn't lose my garage to do it. She is taking too damn long to die." Joe stood up from the floor, dusting the white gypsum powder off his denim trousers with an easy, fluid motion. He didn't hitch his leg once. He walked over to the small kitchen alcove, running a thumb along the clean joints of the molding and the perfectly plumb line of the new door frame. A dry, rare smirk touched his lips as he looked back at me. "Don't let him fool you, Jack," Joe said, leaning his shoulder against the partition wall. "Look at the cabinetry over there. The man used tongue and groove. He purrs like a mountain lion, but he built the old woman a palace." I shifted my weight, running my hand along the smooth, sanded edge of the windowsill. It was tight, professional work. Better than the downtown tenements we usually ended up tossing for clues when some high society name went missing. "It's well made, Paulie," I noted, watching him kick a stray piece of 2x4 out of his way. "Better than that dive you used to live in when we got home from the war. At least with this one, she won't have to fight the roaches for a sandwich." Yeah, laugh it up, Russo. "You too, Jack," Paulie snapped, though his eyes lingered on the clean finish of the crown molding he'd spent 3 nights straight leveling by the light of a bare bulb. "She'll still find something to complain about. Just wait. I could pave these floors in crisp $20 bills and she'd look down her nose and tell me they were the wrong shade of green. Come Sunday, she'll be sitting right there in that armchair, breathing my oxygen, and complaining that the cross breeze gives her stiff joints. Besides, as much as this cost, she might have to fight me for a sandwich." I reached into my shirt pocket, pulling out a pack of Camels. I tapped one out, struck a match on the side of the workbench, and watched the blue smoke drift up toward the raw wood ceiling. "If you hate the setup so much, Paulie, why'd you bother putting the crown molding up?" "Because if it's crooked, she stays in my guest room another month," Paulie muttered, snatching a framing hammer off the floor and tossing it into his kit. "I'm buying my freedom, Morgan. 1 square foot at a time. If I have to give up my workbench to keep her from breathing down my neck while I'm trying to read the morning paper or having an ear to the wall on the rare occasion Veronica wants to throw a piece of ass my way, then the workbench goes." Joe let out a low whistle, walking over to the small window that looked out onto the yard. "Well, you built it to last. If the big one hits and the city slides into the Pacific, this garage will still be standing." "It better be," Paulie growled, pulling a pencil from behind his ear and making a vicious mark on a piece of trim. "Because if a single tile cracks, Veronica will have me out here fixing it on my day off." We packed up the saws, swept the stray pine shavings into a neat pile by the door, and locked up the miniature palace. By the time we climbed into the DeSoto, the Los Angeles heat was already shimmering off the hood. Thick and heavy with the promise of a long afternoon, the breakfast rush at the diner was in full swing when we walked through the door. The air inside was a noisy blend of clattering silverware, sizzling bacon, and loud conversation. Big Mike and his boys from the docks were already stationed at their usual table near the jukebox, giving Rose some friendly jabbing about the speed of the service. Rose just slung a towel over her shoulder, fired back a sharp remark that had the whole table laughing, and kept right on moving. We navigated the crowded aisle to our regular booth in the back and sat down, the vinyl seats cracking slightly under our weight. Rose noticed us the second we settled in. She grabbed 3 mugs from the counter, walked over, and filled them to the brim with steaming dark coffee before we even had to ask. "How is the garage coming along, Polly?" she asked, leaning one hand on the edge of the table. "We just finished up on it a bit ago," Polly replied, blowing on his coffee. "Although I still think I should put in a moat around it and fill it with hungry gators. One day I will hopefully wake up with one less pain in the ass and well-fed gators. If Veronica don't like it, I know where their next meal is coming from." Rose laughed, shaking her head as she scribbled on her pad. "You're a terrible man, Polly." She tucked the pencil behind her ear and walked away to put in our usual order. The banter kept up around the table while we waited, the low hum of the diner washing over us. Joe sat back looking thoroughly relaxed, enjoying the rare morning where his leg wasn't throbbing. It didn't take long before Rose returned, balancing 3 heavy plates of ham and eggs along her forearm, setting them down on the table with practiced ease. "If Sarge hears about your carpentry skills, she might have you fixing up the office," Rose said with a smirk, hovering by the booth for a second longer. "Hell, I'd do it for Sarge," Polly said, digging his fork into a fried egg. "I don't live with her. If she complains, I can simply leave." I leaned back, taking a slow sip of my coffee, and looked at him over the rim of my mug. "To go back to Veronica and her mother?" I asked teasingly. Polly stopped his fork midair, shuddering at the thought. "Hell no. I'd rather go lay on the tracks and hope the Southern Pacific is running on time." Just about then, Dogface and Handsome strolled through the diner door. They took one look around the crowded room, spotted our booth, and started making their way over. "Just give us what they're having," Dogface said to Rose as they passed her, pointing a thick finger toward our plates. "Coming right up," Rose replied, already turning back toward the kitchen hatch without skipping a beat. They slid into the open spots at the table, crowding the booth. Now there were 5 of us bantering, each man trying to top the jabs of the others, while the diner noise hummed around us. It was loud, easy, and completely unhurried. I tapped a fresh ash from my Camel into the glass tray and looked over at Handsome. "How is Duke?" I asked. Dogface cut in before Handsome could even open his mouth. "That big orange bastard is clawing up the furniture, but the Don likes the fur ball, so he won't let me kick him in the head." "If you kick my cat, I'll shoot your big ass," Handsome joked, leaning back against the vinyl cushion with a lazy grin. "You'll just make him mad," I replied, shaking my head. The laughter and bantering continued through another round of coffee. After the plates were cleared and a thick cloud of cigarette smoke hung low over the table, the morning rush started to thin out. I dropped a few bills on the table to cover the check, grabbed my hat, and slid out of the booth. "I guess we should get down to the office," I said, adjusting my collar against the heat that was already creeping through the diner's front doors. "See if Sarge has anything for us to do today. You guys coming?" "Yeah, we're coming," Dogface said, grunting as he hoisted his frame out of the seat. We all piled into the DeSoto, 5 men cramming into the bench seats, and I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and we pulled away from the curb, driving down the sun-baked street toward the office. Chapter 2. The tires chirped against the hot Broadway asphalt as I pulled the DeSoto into the alley behind the office. We piled out, the 5 of us still riding the high of the diner banter, our boots scuffing up the stairs in a loose, unhurried rhythm. The office smelled clean, a sharp mix of lemon polish, fresh floor wax, and the crisp draft coming through the open window. The only thing fighting it was the faint, unmistakable scent of Hammett doing his business over by the litter box in the corner. Sarge was behind her desk, her fingers flying in a steady, aggressive rhythm as she clacked away at the Underwood typewriter, barely looking up as the cavalry stormed back into the room. Everyone was in a particularly good mood today, the easy laughter and joking from the diner carrying right over the threshold. Since we had no open cases on the board, the guys didn't waste any time getting comfortable. Polly dragged the card table into the center of the room, Joe grabbed a fresh deck from the desk drawer, and they sat down to play. Dogface and Handsome pulled up a couple of extra chairs, leaning in with the hungry look of men ready to empty each other's pockets. "I'll bet my mother-in-law," Polly said, tossing his jacket over the back of a chair and leaning over the table as Joe shuffled. "No, it has to be something somebody would want," Joe joked, the cards making a practiced, fluid snap under his thumbs. He didn't hitch his leg once as he slid into his seat. "Do you have a lint-covered piece of gum in your pocket? At least the gum has a purpose," Handsome chimed in, flashing that lazy grin. "You can't chew on a mother-in-law, Polly. She does all the chewing." The cards were dealt out, the chips clinked, and the banter kept rolling right along in a thick cloud of smoke. For a few minutes, it felt like the city was actually letting us have a genuine day off. Then the phone rang, cutting straight through the laughter like a siren. Sarge didn't miss a beat. Her hand shot out, snatching the receiver before the second ring could even get started. Morgan and Russo Detective Agency. She listened to the voice on the other end for a long moment, her expression shifting from casual boredom to a sharp, professional focus. The typing stopped. The keys went silent. She looked up, her eyes locking onto mine over the top of her reading glasses. "Jack, it is the secretary for Eddie Mannix at Metro Goldwyn Mayer Studios," Sarge announced, holding the receiver out toward me. The room went dead quiet. The guys stopped looking at their cards and just looked at each other, confused. The last time Eddie Mannix had contacted me was when that bastard Murphy was using the studio lot as his own personal hunting ground. That whole ugly mess had nearly come to blows between Eddie and me, and none of us had any desire to revisit the kind of grief MGM usually dealt in. I walked over to the desk, the floorboards groaning under my boots, and took the heavy black phone from Sarge's hand. "Morgan," answered my voice flat. "Jack, Mr. Mannix asked me to call you," the secretary said, her voice sounding clean, polished, and entirely too expensive over the wire. "He has an issue he would like to discuss with you." "Tell Eddie to go to hell," I replied. I heard a soft, tired sigh on the other end, followed by the faint rustle of papers on a mahogany desk. "He figured you might say that," the secretary replied smoothly, completely unfazed. "He said to tell you that he will make it worth your time." I looked back at the card table. Joe was watching me, his eyes sharp. Dogface and Handsome had gone quiet, and Polly was chewing on the inside of his cheek. Then I looked out the window at the shimmering Los Angeles heat. Money was money, and whatever else Mannix was, he usually kept his word when it came to a premium paycheck. "Okay, I'll be there shortly," I said, and dropped the receiver back onto the cradle with a heavy click. I turned back to the room, leaning my hip against the edge of Sarge's desk and reaching into my pocket for my Camels. "Anyone want to go back to MGM?" Polly paused, a card held mid-air between his thick fingers. He looked up, his jaw tightening as the memory hit him. "The last time I was there, I was shot." "Yes, but you got to go to the hospital and away from Veronica for a couple of days," I replied teasingly, striking a match and letting the smoke drift. Polly stared at me for a long, silent second, visually weighing the literal lead in his shoulder against the thought of going home to that newly finished guest room. A slow, resigned grin cracked his face, and he shook his head. "Shit! You talked me into it," Polly said, tossing his cards face down onto the felt. "I'll grab my coat." I threw the DeSoto into gear, and the three of us left Broadway behind, tracking west toward Culver City. Dog-Face and Handsome stayed back just long enough to finish their coffee before heading out to take care of some unmentioned business for the dawn, leaving the office to Sarge and Hammett, who was sleeping on his favorite blanket. The drive out was hot and thick with traffic, the midday sun bouncing off the chrome of the oncoming coupes. By the time we pulled up to the massive iron gates on Washington Boulevard, the studio walls looked like a fortress baking in the desert. The guard at the gatehouse didn't even make us kill the engine. He took one look at my face, checked a clipboard, and nodded us through. "Mr. Mannix is expecting you," he said, waving us into the bustling maze of the MGM lot. We parked near the executive building and made our way up to Eddie's office. The outer room was exactly as I remembered it. Cool, expensive, and smelling faintly of perfume and fresh stationery. But Eddie wasn't in his chair. The secretary gave us a polite, practiced smile and told us to take a seat. We waited. It felt like a solid hour ticked by on the wall clock while the secretary organized folders and answered low-volume phone calls. Finally, the heavy mahogany door swung open, and Eddie Mannix walked in. He looked tired, his sleeves already rolled up to his thick forearms, and his face was as hard as a slab of granite. He didn't say a word to any of us. He just walked straight past our chairs, stepped into his office, and clicked the door shut behind him. Another 10 minutes dragged by in silence. Then, the little wooden intercom box on the secretary's desk let out a sharp, aggressive buzz. "Mr. Mannix will see you now," she said, nodding toward the door. I pushed off the leather sofa, Joe and Polly right behind me, and we walked into the inner sanctum. The room was heavy with the scent of imported cigar smoke, the desk fan whirring away in the corner, trying to push the stale air around. I took a slow look around the immaculate carpet before I locked eyes with the man behind the desk. "Nice to see the German's piss stain cleaned up nicely," I said, my voice dry. I was referring to the late Fritz List. It was an old piece of business that Mannix and I were involved in. A night that ended with me holding a cold barrel to the director's forehead until the front of his expensive trousers turned a dark and soggy shade of ruin. Mannix didn't blink. A ghost of a smirk hit his heavy jaw, and he leaned back in his leather chair. "Good to see you, Jack. You too, boys." I didn't sit down. I leaned my hands on the back of the chair opposite his desk, wanting to cut through the Hollywood theater. "What was the call about, Eddie?" Mannix stopped the pleasantries right there. His eyes went flat, the casual studio boss vanishing as he reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy manila folder. He flicked it across the polished wood until it stopped right against my hand. "She's the biggest cash cow Metro's got on the roster this year, Morgan," Mannix said, his voice dropping into a gravelly, low register. "But right now, someone is promising to put a piece of lead in her before her next picture wraps." I didn't look at the file yet. I kept my eyes locked on Mannix as the desk fan chopped through the heavy cigar smoke. "You've got a whole department of studio muscle, Eddie," I said, my voice flat. "Why call us?" "Because my guys know how to bury a drunken disorderly or pay off a pregnant script girl," Mannix grunted, leaning forward and resting his thick forearms on the mahogany. "They don't know how to stop a professional who knows exactly how the family operates. Look at the file." I flipped the folder open. The glossy headshot on top showed a stunning blonde with piercing blue eyes and a perfectly manicured pout. The name stamped in gold ink underneath was Barbara Tash. But as I flipped the page, the glossy studio biography vanished, replaced by the raw, unvarnished paper of a real background check. "Dorothy Jane Hawkswell," I read aloud. "Born in Eureka Springs, Arkansas." "Yeah," Mannix said, spitting a shred of tobacco onto the floor. "Her old man was the town drunk, stumbled out of a speakeasy back in the 20s and walked right into the path of a Frisco passenger train while it was backing into the station. Chopped him right to pieces. The mother, Clara, used the tragedy to pack up and drag the kid out here in L.A., chasing the brass ring. Clara failed, so she spent the next 20 years pushing the girl into every singing, dancing, and elocution lesson the city had to offer. She manufactured Barbara Tash out of whole cloth. Joe leaned over my shoulder, scanning the report. His eyes flicked over the family history. And now the kid is paying the bills. Paying them? Mannix let out a dry, humorless laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. Clara lives like a queen off the girl's contract. She treats that kid like a personal bank account and a meal ticket. But someone from Clara's past, some low-rent, slick-talking character who got discarded the minute the MGM money started rolling in, has crawled out of the woodwork. Mannix reached into his top drawer, pulled out a stack of cheap, unlined paper, and tossed them on top of the glossy headshot. The handwriting was jagged, pressed so hard into the paper, it had nearly torn through. He's been sending letters directly to Barbara's dressing room, detailed ones. He doesn't just want money, Jack. He wants to destroy the mother by taking away the only thing she cares about. He's going to kill the girl just to watch the old woman starve. I picked up one of the notes, the scent of cheap dime store ink hitting my nose. You got a name on this ghost, Eddie? Victor Elliot, Mannix said, the name tasting like sour whiskey in his mouth. A small-time pool room hustler and blackmail artist who hangs around the edges of Sunset Boulevard. Back when Clara first hit town, she was desperate, and Elliot was her ticket into the fringe of the Hollywood nightlife, introducing her to the kind of sharks who promise screen tests for a price. The minute Barbara caught the studio's eye and signed her first real contract, Clara dropped Elliot like a bad habit. She threatened to have our security boys break his legs if he ever showed his face near the gates again. He's been stewing on that grudge for years, and now he's come to collect. He knows the lot, he knows the schedules, and he's slick enough to blend in with the background talent. I tucked the letters back into the manila folder and closed it with a sharp thud. I knew the type. Hollywood was full of vultures, but the ones driven by 20 years of sour jealousy were the ones that usually didn't stop until they spilled blood. The gossip rags say she's a nightmare to work with, Eddie, Joe noted, crossing his arms. Temperamental. Difficult. She's a scared kid playing a part, Mannix corrected bluntly, looking straight at Joe. She screams at directors because she thinks it's what a movie star is supposed to do to keep people from seeing through the makeup. She's sheltered, Joe. She thinks the studio walls are made of iron. She doesn't have the kind of tough shell you guys have. If she finds out the real reason someone is hunting her, that her own mother's sins brought this to her door, it'll break her before the bullet even touches her. Mannix stood up, placing both palms flat on the desk, looking directly at me. Keep her alive. Keep her on the set. And find Elliot before he gets a clear line of sight. I'm paying your standard rate, plus a premium for the discretion. Do we have a deal? I looked down at the closed file under my hand, then shifted my gaze out the window toward the massive soundstages where the manufactured magic was made. I could already hear Paulie grumbling about babysitting a diva, but a job was a job, and Mannix's money spent just as well as anyone else's. I picked up the folder and tucked it under my arm. Where's the girl right now, Eddie? Chapter 3. The air outside the executive building was like a physical weight, but it was nothing compared to the tension simmering inside the soundstage. Eddie Mannix walked with us, his wingtips clicking in a brisk, no-nonsense cadence against the asphalt as he led Joe, Paulie, and me toward stage 4. He didn't speak, and neither did we. We knew the drill. You don't talk business in the open on a studio lot. The walls have ears, and the extras are always listening for a tip they can sell to the rags. Mannix pulled open the heavy insulated door to the soundstage, and the cavernous, dimly lit interior hit us. It smelled of hot electricity, lumber, and stale coffee. But before our eyes could even adjust to the shadows beyond the giant stage lights, the sound of a shattering glass cut through the hum of the crew. I don't care if he has 6 kids and a sick wife, Arthur. A sharp, piercing voice echoed from the center of the illuminated set. He's fired! Get him off my stage! We walked deeper into the labyrinth of cables and wooden flats. Standing under the blinding glare of a key light was Barbara Tash. In person, she was even more striking than her headshot. A porcelain face framed by platinum waves. but right now her features were twisted into a mask of pure fury. She was glaring down at a middle-aged director who looked like he hadn't slept since the Hoover administration. "Barbara, please," the director groaned, rubbing his temples. "Milt is the best lighting technician Metro has. He's just trying to balance the shadows on the brickwork." "He's lighting me like a gargoyle," she snapped, her voice trembling with an intense, icy heat that felt entirely too practiced. "Look at my cheekbones. I look like a corpse. If he can't understand how to make me look like a star, find someone who can. Otherwise, I'm going to my trailer, and you can shoot the back of my double's head for the rest of the afternoon." The entire crew stood frozen. Men holding boom mics and script supervisors held their breath, waiting for the storm to pass. Mannix didn't even flinch. He just chewed on his cigar, waited for the screaming to die down to a low simmer, and then stepped out of the shadows into the light. "That's enough, Barbara," Mannix said, his gravelly voice instantly cutting through the theatrical tension. The actress snapped her head around, her eyes flashing, but she visibly checked herself when she saw the studio boss. The haughty defiance dialed back just a notch, replaced by a cold, defensive stillness. "Hetty," she said, smoothing down the front of her expensive silk period dress. "Tell me you're here to give me a crew that actually knows how to make a movie." "I'm here to give you a detail," Mannix said bluntly, waving his thick hand toward the three of us. "This is Jack Morgan, Joe Russo, and Paulie. They're taking over your security until this picture wraps. You do what they say when they say it." Barbara's piercing blue eyes dragged slowly across the three of us. She looked at my scuffed boots, Joe's worn trench coat, and the slight bulge under Paulie's jacket where his shoulder holster sat. A sneer of pure disgust curled her perfectly painted lips. "This is a joke, right?" she asked, looking back at Mannix. "You bring 3 back alley bouncers onto my set? Look at how they're dressed. They look uncouth, Eddie. They smell like cheap whiskey and stale tobacco. I am the biggest draw this studio has, and you expect me to be seen with men who look like they rolled out of a Bowery flophouse." Joe crossed his arms, his face completely expressionless, but Paulie's jaw tightened. He took a slow step forward, leaning his thick frame into the light just enough for her to see the hard line of his mouth. "A monkey suit won't stop a bullet, sister," Paulie said, his voice flat and dry as dust. "But we will. So keep your fucking shirt on." Barbara gasped, her face turning a sharp, furious crimson as she looked to Mannix for an intervention. But the director chose that exact moment to break the deadlock. "All right, that's lunch, everyone. 1 hour," he called out through a megaphone, sounding incredibly relieved to escape the line of fire. The tension broke as the crew instantly scattered, glad to be away from the star's orbit. Barbara gave us one last venomous look, turned on her heel, and marched off the set toward the heavy stage doors, her silk train rustling aggressively against the plywood floor. "Keep an eye on her," Mannix grunted to me, already turning back toward the executive offices. "Go introduce yourselves to the mother. She handles the schedule." Joe, Paulie, and I followed a few paces behind Barbara as she crossed the sun-baked asphalt toward the row of luxury private trailers. She slammed the door of her dressing room so hard the aluminum frame rattled, but we didn't wait for an invitation. I turned the brass knob and pushed the door open, stepping into the air-conditioned sanctuary of the trailer. Sitting on a plush velvet sofa in the corner, holding a small silver tea set, was an elegant, older woman dressed in a sophisticated, matronly gray suit. She looked up, her face instantly melting into an expression of soft, deeply anxious maternal concern. "Oh, Dorothy Jane, darling," the woman said smoothly, her voice a polished, comforting purr as she set her teacup down. "I heard the shouting from here. What has upset you now?" The air conditioning in the trailer hummed a low, expensive tune, a stark contrast to the oppressive Culver City heat waiting just outside the aluminum door. Barbara's mother sat on a plush velvet sofa in the corner, holding a small silver tea set. She looked unassuming enough, a picture of matronly elegance in her tailored gray suit, though her eyes never truly settled. They tracked Barbara's every movement, with an overprotective, hawk-like intensity. I stepped forward, removing my hat and letting the door click shut behind Joe and Polly. "Jack Morgan," I said, introducing myself and the guys. "Mannix hired us to keep watch over your daughter." She set her silver teapot down with a soft, delicate click, her face melting into an expression of deeply anxious maternal concern. "I still don't think it's necessary," she said, her voice a smooth, polished purr. "But if the studio wants to waste their money..." Joe crossed his arms, his sharp eyes already mapping the trailer's exits. "I don't believe a death threat is something to take lightly, miss." The older woman's posture instantly stiffened, her chin lifting with a sharp, brittle sort of dignity that felt entirely manufactured. "Miss Tash," she corrected firmly, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Miss Clara Tash. My daughter took my name for the screen, Mr. Russo. And I can assure you, I know exactly what is and isn't a threat to my girl. I've been dealing with the sharks in this town since we first stepped off the train from Arkansas. Well, Miss Tash, if Mannix thinks the threat is real enough to call us in, it's a viable threat," I said, keeping my voice flat and professional. We spent the rest of the lunch hour getting to know the mother, or at least the saintly martyr version of herself she wanted to sell us. She did most of the talking, painting a vivid picture of a devoted mother who had sacrificed her own youth at the altar of her daughter's career. "You gentlemen see a glamorous movie star," Claire said, leaning forward and smoothing the fabric over her knee. "But you don't see the years of dedication it took to build her. The vocal coaches, the elocution lessons, the long nights. I gave up my entire life, my own dreams, to ensure my Dorothy Jane had the world at her feet. A mother's love means standing as a shield between her child and the vultures. I control her schedule, her contracts, her circle, everything. Because without me, the wolves in this town would have torn her apart years ago." While Clara spun her tale of maternal devotion, Barbara quietly ate her lunch in the corner. The roaring lioness we'd met on the soundstage earlier was completely gone, replaced by a person who seemed almost fearful. She was submissive, shrinking back into the plush velvet cushions, keeping her eyes glued to her plate. She only spoke when spoken to, offering quiet, eerie obedience to her mother's sharp, administrative commands. Yet, for all of Clara's doting talk, I caught her looking at Barbara's diamond bracelet and the MGM contract sitting on the vanity with a cold, hollow resentment that vanished the second she noticed me watching. When the hour was over, the assistant director knocked on the door. Barbara stood up, passive as a ghost, and the three of us followed her back out into the cavernous, bustling maze of Stage 4. As she stepped back under the blinding glare of the key lights, the mood had changed. She was calmer now, hitting her marks with a quiet, practiced precision that made it easy to see why she was Metro's biggest cash cow. But the piece didn't last long. During a rehearsal for a crowded ballroom scene, a background actress moved a fraction of a second too early. A simple, accidental step that briefly blocked Barbara from the primary lens. In an instant, the fragile girl from the trailer was incinerated. Barbara went off on another venomous tirade, her voice cutting through the soundstage like a razor blade as she ruthlessly tore into the extras' appearance and competence. The poor girl was left standing there trembling before she finally ran off the set in tears. The director sighed into his megaphone, calling for a reset, leaving Barbara standing in the center of the stage. She adjusted her silk gloves, a smug smile of satisfaction curling her lips as she basked in the absolute silence of the intimidated crew. Paulie shifted his weight, leaning his thick frame closer to me as the assistant directors scrambled to replace the extra. "She's a real peach, isn't she?" Paulie asked, his voice a low, dry grunt. I watched the starlet turn her face back toward the lens, the jarring swing between her hollow fear in the dressing room and her cruelty on the set, leaving a sour taste in my mouth. "Yeah," I said, reaching into my pocket for my pack of Camels. "We might need to ask Eddie for hazard pay." Chapter 4. The rest of the afternoon was a slow burn of watching a movie get made. which is mostly just a lot of men in overalls moving heavy furniture around while the star stays in her trailer. Joe took the catwalks above the rafters, Paulie leaned his thick frame against the exit doors, and I stayed close to the edge of the lights. We scanned every face in that cavernous room, the prop guys, the makeup girls, the camera assistants. Nothing. Everyone was doing their jobs, keeping their heads down, and trying not to catch the starlet's eye. The piece broke just before the final setup of the day. Claire came bursting through the stage doors, her matronly elegance completely shattered into a frantic, high-pitched panic. Her tailored gray suit was rumpled, and her breathing was shallow as she ran straight up to us. "Mr. Morgan, it happened again," she gasped, thrusting a piece of paper into my hand. "It was left right on her door while she was on set. The security on this lot is atrocious." I unfolded the paper. Same venomous tone, same ugly promises. But this time, the author had been sloppy. Down in the bottom corner, right where the paper had been held tight, was a distinct, smudged thumbprint left in fresh black ink. "Joe, Paulie, cover the exits," I barked. "Nobody leaves this stage." I walked over to the director, took his megaphone, and let my voice echo off the high rafters. "Listen up. Metro business is officially paused. Rap is on hold. Before anyone steps out into that sunshine, you're forming a line by the camera trucks. We're inspecting hands." If the threat was an inside job by a disgruntled crew member, maybe Milt, the lighting guy, or someone sympathetic to the extra Barbara had reduced to tears, the proof would be right on their fingers. We spent the next 40 minutes checking palms. We looked at grease from the lights, carbon from the arcs, and dirt from the flats. But when the last background extra showed us his clean palms, the trail went cold. Everybody on stage 4 was clean. With the sun dipping below the Culver City horizon, we piled into the DeSoto and trailed Barbara's sleek town car through the evening traffic, tracking them all the way up into the winding, manicured hills of Beverly Hills. The estate was massive, the exact type of limestone fortress you buy when you don't just want to live well, but you want to actively shove your wealth down the neighborhood's throat. It was a monument to MGM paychecks and a hell of a long way from the dirt roads of Arkansas. Inside, the house felt less like a home and more like an echoing museum. The ceilings were vaulted, the marble floors were polished to a mirror shine, and our footsteps bounced off the walls like gunshots. "Mother has the largest room," Barbara said, her voice dropping as she looked up the grand staircase. She sounded smaller here, the fierce Hollywood diva melting away into the quiet, hollowed-out girl from the dressing room. It's the least I could do for all she has done for me. She was exhausted, her shoulders sagging under the weight of the day, and I noticed it right then. When she was tired, no amount of expensive studio elocution lessons could fully wipe away that Northwest Arkansas twang. The smooth, cultured accent she used for the cameras fractured, letting the country girl from Eureka Springs slip through the cracks. I looked from Barbara to Clara, who was already barking orders at a maid about the dinner service. The ink on the note was fresh, the soundstage had been clean, and the mother was the only one who had been near that dressing room when the cameras were rolling. The pieces of the puzzle were not fitting together. The leather seat of the DeSoto wasn't built for sleeping, especially with a Colt 45 digging into my ribs. But you take what you can get on a stakeout. The three of us crowded into the car, keeping the windows cracked just enough to catch the midnight breeze. The neighborhood was dead quiet, the kind of expensive silence that only money can buy, with nothing but the occasional rustle of palm leaves. I had just managed to drift off into a light, uneasy doze when it felt like a bulldozer hit my sternum. A hand the similar of a raw ham slammed into my chest, knocking the air clean out of my lungs. "What the hell was that about?" I wheezed, sitting up fast and swatting Paulie's arm away. "Trying to crush my rib cage?" "They're moving," Paulie said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that instantly killed the sleep in my brain. He was already leaning forward, his eyes glued to the dark driveway across the street. In the back seat, Joe was already upright, his hand instinctively resting on the door handle, and they damn sure were moving. The estate's massive iron gates were swinging open, and the sleek black town car was rolling out into the pre-dawn mist without its headlights on. It was barely 4:30 a.m. I twisted the key, and the DeSoto's engine turned over with a low, reliable purr. I slammed it into gear and let the clutch out, pulling away from the curb just as the town car hit the main road and mashed the accelerator. They weren't just driving, they were flying. By the time I cleared the first winding curve of the canyon, the town car was already a quarter-mile ahead, its taillights cutting sharp, red streaks through the gray morning fog. The driver didn't care about the blind turns or the steep drops. He was taking the corners on two wheels, hugging the inside lines with a terrifying, practiced precision. "Jesus," Polly muttered, grabbing the dashboard as the DeSoto swerved to match a brutal hairpin turn. "Who's behind the wheel of that thing? Barney Oldfield?" "Worse," I said, white-knuckling the steering wheel as the tires squealed against the asphalt. "Their driver must have run moonshine at some point, the way he drives. He knows exactly how to handle a heavy back end at top speed." But as the town car blew past the turnoff for the Sunset Strip and pointed its hood straight toward Culver City, the fog in my brain finally cleared. I eased my foot off the gas just a hair, letting the DeSoto settle into a less frantic rhythm. "Relax, Polly," I muttered, shaking my head as the tension drained out of my shoulders. "They aren't running. She's doing a costume picture." Polly blinked, still holding onto the dashboard. "A what?" "A costume picture," I repeated, reaching into my pocket for a Camel to steady my nerves. "Think about that heavy silk rig she was wearing yesterday. The hair, the wardrobe, the layers of pancake makeup. It takes hours to turn a girl from Arkansas into a 19th century duchess. This isn't a midnight run. It's just a standard morning for a star." From the back seat, Joe let out a soft, dry chuckle. 4:30 in the morning, just to get your hair combed. Remind me to never let my daughters get into pictures. "You'd have to have daughters first, dummy," I replied. We trailed them at a safe, respectable distance, all the way back to the MGM gates. The studio lot looked entirely different in the pre-dawn gray, quiet, eerie, and stripped of its daytime glamour. The town car glided through the security checkpoint, and I rolled the DeSoto right in behind it, flashing our studio passes to the sleepy guard. We watched from across the asphalt as Clara escorted Barbara out of the car. Even at this ungodly hour, Clara was hovering, adjusting the collar of her daughter's coat as they marched toward the makeup building. Barbara looked like a sleepwalker, her head down, completely passive, leaving her mother to do all the talking with the early morning crew. "Well," I said, turning off the ignition and watching the yellow light spill from the makeup building windows, "we've got a long few hours of drinking bad commissary coffee ahead of us before they ever roll a frame of film." By the time the cameras started rolling again, the bitch was back. She was in her co-star's face, about flubbing his lines. Any trace of the tired country girl from early this morning, completely buried under layers of pancake makeup and cold Hollywood vanity. "Can't you fucking read? We're on our last day of shooting, and you still haven't memorized the script?" she screeched, her voice echoing off the high rafters of stage 4. Polly elbowed me in the ribs and whispered in my ear, "If someone talked to me like that, I'd want to shoot them myself." "Yeah, tell me about it," I whispered back, keeping my eyes on the crew. Half of them looked like they wanted to drop their equipment and walk off the lot right then and there. We watched the morning's proceedings move at a grueling, miserable crawl. About the time lunch was called, we were getting ready to stretch our legs when a sudden commotion came cutting across the asphalt from the direction of the trailers. It wasn't just shouting, it was a high-pitched, frantic shrieking. We ran all the way there, Joe and Polly right on my heels, and burst into the dressing room to find the place an absolute mess. The air-conditioned sanctuary had been turned upside down. The heavy vanity mirror had been completely smashed, and glittering shards of glass were everywhere, scattered across the plush velvet carpet like a broken ice storm. Clara was huddled in the corner, clutching her chest. She had deep, nasty cuts on her arms that looked exactly like defensive wounds. When I knelt down and tried asking her what happened, she gripped my lapels, her eyes wide and rolling with terror. All she could scream over and over was, "Vic did it! Vic did it!" I looked around the room, the jaded cop brain in the back of my head, instantly taking notes. The window was too small for a man to climb through. The door didn't look like it was forced open at all. And when I glanced back out at the busy studio lot, nobody had seen anyone anywhere near the trailer. They just heard the glass breaking and the dramatic screaming. "Polly, secure the perimeter anyway. Joe, call for the studio nurse to bandage her up," I ordered, stepping carefully over a fragment of the mirror. Barbara was in tears, looking entirely paralyzed as she watched the nurse tend to her mother's bleeding arms. The fragile, terrified daughter was back, completely shattered by the sudden burst of violence. It was a good thing the picture was wrapping. If whoever did this had the balls to attack the mother in broad daylight on a busy studio lot, they were running out of time, and they were getting desperate. I stepped back out into the blistering noon heat, lighting a Camel to take the edge off. We had a maniac hunting a movie star, an invisible suspect who could slip past Metro security like a ghost, and only a few hours left before the director yelled "cut" for the final time. The clock was ticking, and the air on the lot felt like a powder keg waiting for a match. Chapter 5. When the director finally hollered "cut" and "print" for the last time, the soundstage didn't erupt into the usual cheers. The crew just packed up their gear in a quiet, unnerved hurry, desperate to get away from the bad luck hanging over the picture. With the studio lot emptying out and the sun completely gone, Joe and I huddled up. We decided the only way to guarantee Barbara and her mother stayed safe through the night was to pull them off the grid entirely and take them back to our agency office. When we got there, the neon sign from across the street was buzzing, casting stale red shadows across the floorboards. We explained the situation to Sarge, who was sitting behind her desk. She was not impressed, her fountain pen tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against her ledger. The mother was also not impressed. Clara stood in the center of the room, her bandaged arms crossed over her rumpled gray suit, looking around the office with a sneer that could have curdled milk. "You want me to stay here, in this dump?" she demanded, her voice dripping with pure Hollywood disgust. Joe didn't even bother taking off his trench coat. He snapped right back, "Listen, lady, this is the only way to keep you safe. It's not much, but it's safe here." Claire marched over to the leather sofa, resting in the corner, and poked it with a manicured finger. "Are we supposed to sleep on this filthy piece of furniture, covered in grease and cat hair?" she asked, turning her glare back on us. Polly, who was already leaning his thick frame against the door frame, gave her a lazy grin. "It sure is comfortable, though." "I will not listen to this," Clara hissed, her face flushing a dangerous, sharp crimson. She spun around on her heel, pointing a sharp finger across the room. "Get Mr. Mannix on the phone this instant. You, girl at the desk." She directed the order straight towards Sarge. Sarge didn't move an inch. She didn't reach for the switchboard, and she didn't blink. She just slowly lowered her pen and stared back at Clara, glaring at her with icy blue eyes that could have frozen a boiling kettle. By this time, I had heard enough. The exhaustion of the 4:30 a.m. stakeout, the high-speed canyon chase, and the long day of dealing with Hollywood prima donnas finally boiled over. I stepped into the middle of the room, raising my voice over the commotion until it echoed off the glass doors. "Listen, lady, Mannix hired us to keep your daughter safe," I barked, my voice cutting through the room like a razor blade. "If you want to go out and take your chances with someone threatening to kill her, I won't stop you. But Barbara stays here, and until we can track down Victor, I suggest you stay as well." Clara opened her mouth to argue, her chest heaving, but I took a step closer, crowding her space until she actually shrank back a half inch. "But the truth is, I don't give a fuck about what happens to you," I said, keeping my tone deadly flat. "You want to leave? There's the door. You want to live, sit your country bumpkin ass on that couch, and shut your fucking mouth. The office went completely stone-dead quiet. Barbara, sitting quietly in the corner chair, looked up with wide, stunned eyes. Clara froze, the theatrical elegance entirely draining out of her face, as the raw, unvarnished truth of a hard-boiled L.A. detective hit her right between the eyes. For a split second, the polished Miss Tash facade cracked entirely, leaving nothing but a stunned, furious woman from Arkansas staring up at the business end of my bad temper. To twist the knife and drive the point home, I didn't let up. I leaned in just a little closer, letting her feel the full weight of the room. "And let's be clear about something else," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal purr. "If your daughter dies, you lose your meal ticket. I don't see any studios asking for Clara Tash." This was not knocking her off her high horse. This was blowing the horse's fucking brains out. The theatrical indignation completely drained from her face, leaving her looking older, frailer, and suddenly very exposed. The reality of her dependency hit her like a physical blow. She sank back into the threadbare leather couch, the fight entirely gone from her posture, and quietly muttered, "You win. We'll stay." Across the room, Sarge finally broke her icy silence, her eyes shifting over to Polly. "Polly, you need to go home. Veronica has been blowing the phone up all evening." She glanced down at her message log with a faint, dangerous smirk. "She said if you weren't back soon, she was going to cut off what little manhood you had left." Polly's tough guy facade vanished in a fraction of a second. He swallowed hard, instantly grabbing his fedora from the coat rack and adjusting his jacket over his shoulder holster. "Yeah, right. Handcuffed to the radiator next time," he muttered, already making a beeline for the door. "See you palookas in the morning." With the door clicking shut behind Polly, Joe turned his sharp, quiet gaze toward me. He looked at the deep lines of exhaustion on my face, probably thinking about the 4:30 a.m. wake-up call we'd both endured. "You go home too, Jack," Joe said, leaning his thick frame against the filing cabinet. "I'm sure Rose is worried. I can stay here and keep watch on the ladies tonight." I rubbed the back of my neck, feeling every single hour of the stakeout catching up to me at once. "You're probably right," I admitted. I scooped Hammett up from his favorite spot under the desk, the big tomcat giving me a thoroughly displeased meow for disrupting his nap, and tucked him under my arm before heading out to the DeSoto. By the time I let myself into the apartment, the city outside was finally quiet. But Rose was still awake, sitting under the dim glow of the parlor lamp. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice a mix of heavy relief and sharp anxiety as she stood up to meet me. "I have not heard from you since yesterday morning." I set Hammett down on the rug, kicked off my scuffed boots, and pulled her close, burying my face in her hair. I explained the volatile situation down at Metro, the toxic starlet, the notes with the ink smudges, and the bloody mess left in the dressing room. She listened quietly, the tension slowly leaving her shoulders as she realized I'd made it back in one piece. When the story was told, we finally turned off the lamps and went to bed. As I drifted off into the mattress, my last comforting thought was that, at least in the morning, I wouldn't be awoken to Polly's ham-sized hand slapping me across the chest. By the time Rose's alarm rang, I was actually feeling rested, wanting nothing more than a brief slice of normalcy before diving back into the Hollywood storm. I drove Rose to work and helped her set up for the breakfast rush, lifting the heavy crates of produce and wiping down the counters. My payment: a big plate of ham and eggs, and a piping hot cup of black coffee that tasted better than anything Metro's commissary could ever brew. Just as I was scraping the last of the egg yolk with a piece of toast, the morning crowd started rolling in through the front doors. It was Big Mike and his regular construction crew, followed closely by Paulie, who still looked slightly relieved to have his manhood intact after his midnight deadline with Veronica. Trailing right behind Paulie were Handsome and Dogface, their knuckles still looking a bit raw from whatever back alley business they'd been wrapping up the night before. Joe was probably fast asleep at his desk by now, and Sarge should be showing up to open the office doors any minute. The office could wait a little longer. I gestured for Handsome and Dogface to slide into the booth across from me. Once they settled in, I leaned forward and looked at Dogface. "You know a guy named Victor?" I asked. Dogface rubbed his chin, squinting through the haze of cigarette smoke. "Vic, yeah, I know him. He used to do odd jobs for the boss a few years back. Why?" "I have some questions I would like to ask him," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. "He won't be hard to find." "Does he have something to do with that Mannix case you're working?" Handsome asked, leaning his elbows on the table. "Right now, he is the prime suspect," I admitted, keeping my voice low so the construction crew at the counter wouldn't hear. "But something feels off about it." "Clara." Dogface cut me off before I could finish the thought. "Clara? That hillbilly broad he was with years ago? What's she got to do with it?" "She thinks he is the one sending death threats to her daughter, Barbara," I explained. "Yesterday, Clara got cut up pretty bad inside the dressing trailer. When we found her, she was hysterical, just repeating over and over that Vic did it." Dogface shook his head, a genuine look of disbelief crossing his weathered face. "That don't seem like the Vic I know. He loved that kid and tried to make it work with the mother, but as soon as the dough started rolling in, she was too good for his kind." I looked at him hard, the gears in my head shifting as the puzzle pieces started spinning in a completely new direction. "Do you think you could track him down for me?" "Sure thing, pal," Dogface said, sliding out of the booth and adjusting his flat cap. "I'll call you at the office the second I find him." Chapter 6. Before I left, I ordered 4 breakfast meals to go, packaged up tight in brown paper bags to keep the heat in. When they were done, I kissed Rose goodbye, and Polly and I headed back to the apartment just long enough to scoop up Hammett before making our way to the agency. As soon as I opened the office door and set the big tomcat down on the linoleum, he took one look around the room, marched straight over to the leather couch, and jumped right into Claire's lap. "Get this disgusting thing off me," she shrieked, giving the cat a hard, unceremonious shove. Hammett let out an ugly, defensive hiss at her, jumped down, and trotted off to find his favorite corner under the desk to lick his wounded pride. I set one of the bags on Sarge's desk. "Compliments of the chef," I said. She gave me a rare, appreciative then I walked them down the hall to Joe's office. Sure enough, he was fast asleep at his desk, his chin resting against his chest. I reached out and touched his shoulder. "I got some chow for you," I said softly. Joe blinked his eyes open, shaking the fog out of his head, and looked at the steaming bag. "Thanks, Jack. I sure need it." Back in the main room, Claire was already peering into the remaining boxes with a pinched expression. "It's not what I would have ordered, but it will have to do," she sighed, her upper lip curling. "I was afraid you would let us starve." "Keep it up, and I just might," I muttered, not looking at her as I handed a bag to Barbara. Barbara held the warm box in her hands, her eyes fixed on my office door. She looked smaller today, stripped of the elaborate studio costumes and the aggressive posture she put on for the crew. "May I eat in your office so we can talk?" Barbara asked, her voice quiet, almost pleading. "Sure, come on," I said, tilting my head toward the door. The mother's maternal radar instantly went off, and she bolted upright from the couch, her bandaged arms flailing. "If you insist on talking to her, I insist on being in the room." "Sit," Sarge ordered from behind her desk. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried the weight of a brass knuckle. Claire froze, looked into Sarge's icy blue eyes, and slowly sank back down into the leather, quietly chewing on a piece of toast without another word. Once inside my office, I shut the frosted glass door, cutting off the noise from the lobby. I sat behind my desk, and the kid sat across from me. She didn't even touch the brown paper bag containing her food. Instead, she just leaned her elbows on the desk, buried her face in her hands for a long, heavy moment, and then spilled her guts. The words came out in a breathless, exhausting rush, like a dam breaking after years of holding back the river. She talked about the suffocating pressure from Metro, the endless loops of publicity photos, and the terrifying weight of being the studio's golden goose. But the real venom wasn't directed at Eddie Mannix. It was reserved for the woman sitting out in our lobby. Barbara talked about how Clara controlled every single aspect of her life. Where she went, who she was allowed to talk to, and who she could date. She handled every dime of the contracts, doling out allowances like Barbara was an associate producer's charity case. "I paid for that entire estate," Barbara whispered, her voice trembling as she finally looked up, her eyes wide and red-rimmed. "Every brick, every piece of limestone, every polished marble floor. Yet, when I'm there, I feel like an unwanted guest in my own home. I have to ask permission just to walk into the sitting room. But she tells me over and over again how much I owe her. She reminds me every single day that I would be absolutely nothing without her. She says I'd still be scrubbing floors in Arkansas if she hadn't sacrificed her youth to drag me out to California." She paused, her lower lip quivering, her fingers nervously twisting a loose thread on her sleeve. She looked across the desk at me, her cinematic mask completely gone. "Can I have a cigarette, Jack?" I tapped a Camel out of the pack, handed it to her, and flicked my Zippo. She leaned in, her hand shaking slightly as she took the flame. She pulled the smoke deep into her lungs, letting it trail out of her nose and mouth before she continued. "You see me on the set, Jack, and you think I'm a monster," she said, her voice dropping into that quiet, genuine Northwest Arkansas twang Dogface had mentioned earlier. "I know what the crew says about me. I know they call me a bitch behind my back. I screamed at Arthur. I fired Milt. I even tore into that poor background girl yesterday until she cried." She took another long drag, staring at the glowing orange tip of the cigarette. "But you don't understand. If I don't demand perfection, if I don't act like a queen every second I'm under those hot lights, my mother gets in my ear. She tells me I'm losing my edge. She tells me the studio's going to replace me with some younger girl from the theater logs, and that we'll be broke and humiliated. So I scream. I fight everyone on that lot just to prove to her that I'm still a star. I act like a tyrant on the stage because it's the only place in the world where my mother can't stand right next to me and pull my strings." She leaned back in the chair, a single tear cutting a clean line through the lingering studio powder on her cheek. "I love what I do," she said, her voice dropping so low it was barely audible over the hum of the ceiling fan. "I love the acting. When the director yells action for just a few minutes, I get to be someone else. Someone brave. Someone who isn't Dorothy Jane Hawkswell from Eureka Springs. But the rest of the time, there are times I would rather give it all up, pack a single suitcase, and disappear into the night rather than keep living like this." I sat there in the quiet of the office, the blue smoke swirling between us, settling over the paperwork on my desk. For all her cruelty on the soundstage and her diva hysterics, she was just a trapped bird in a very expensive, very gilded cage. I felt for the girl, a genuine ache of pity twisting in my gut. I've stared down some of the meanest thugs in Los Angeles, but looking at this broken, tear-stained kid, I just didn't know what to say. "Stay in here as long as you need to. Eat your breakfast," I said, my voice dropping its edge for a second. I turned and walked to the door, stepping back out into the main lobby just in time to catch Clara launching into a loud, self-pitying diatribe. "I was supposed to be the star," Clara sneered, waving a piece of toast at the walls. "But the studios in this town were blind. I auditioned for Warner Brothers years ago. And do you know what Jack Warner told me? He said I didn't have what it takes. Can you imagine? And their biggest contract star at the time was a damn dog. Rin Tin Tin. They chose a mutt over me." She let out a bitter, jagged laugh and adjusted the bandages on her arms. "But I made sure she had the chances I didn't. The sacrifices I made for that girl, I put her in every elocution class, every dance academy in town. And if she messed up, if she got lazy or flubbed a line, I punished her. I stayed on her and continued punishing her until she got it right. That's how you make a star." That last part caught Sarge's ear. The rhythmic tapping of her fountain pen stopped dead. Sarge slowly stood up from her desk, her face a mask of absolute granite, and slipped past me into my private office, quietly shutting the door behind her. Paulie leaned over, his shoulder bumping mine, and whispered under his breath, "Jack, I might have to go home and give the mother-in-law a big kiss right on the mouth tonight. She's an absolute saint compared to this one." Before I could answer, the frosted glass door cracked open. Sarge peeked her head out, her icy eyes locking onto mine. "Jack," she said, her voice tight and dangerously low, "you need to see this. Come inside." I stepped back into the office, Paulie shadowing me. Sarge closed the door and turned to Barbara, her tone softening into something steady and protective. "All right, honey, lift your dress again. Lower your knickers just a bit." Barbara complied, her eyes fixed on the floorboards, completely silent. When the fabric shifted, it exposed her bare buttocks, crisscrossed and covered in thick, faded white healing scars. The permanent roadmap of brutal, years-old beatings. A hot, blinding wave of fury slammed into my chest, turning my blood to pure acid. I looked at those marks, then looked at the closed door leading to the lobby where Clara was still squawking. "I should go out there and kill her right now," I said, my hand instinctively dropping toward the Colt under my jacket. Barbara quickly adjusted her clothes, her face pale as she quietly pleaded with me. "No, Jack, please don't do that. Don't. She's all I have." I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the rage down into a cold, hard knot. We walked back out into the lobby, and a minute later, Barbara followed us, silently crossing the room to sit right back down on the leather couch next to her mother. Clara didn't waste a second. She grabbed Barbara's wrist, her eyes narrowing into slits. "What did you tell them in there?" she demanded. "Nothing," Barbara muttered, keeping her head down. "Just that I love my work and hope to do it for as long as I can." Crack! Clara swung her hand and slapped Barbara hard across the face, the sound echoing like a pistol shot in the small office. "Do not lie to your mother," Clara hissed. That was the exact moment the fuse hit the powder. Sarge didn't walk across the room. She launched herself. Before Clara could even register the movement, Sarge grabbed the front of the mother's tailored suit jacket, hoisted her clean off the leather couch like she weighed nothing at all, and slammed her hard against the plaster wall. The frame on the wall rattled. "If you lay another hand on her in this office, I'll kill you myself," Sarge roared, her face inches from Clara's. I didn't move an inch. I just crossed my arms, leaning back against the door frame to watch the performance in grim, thoroughly satisfied amusement. Clara's eyes were wide with a sudden, primitive terror, her breath catching in her throat as she realized the woman holding her by the throat wasn't a studio executive she could scream at. Joe and Paulie stepped in quickly, putting their hands on Sarge's shoulders, gently talking her down before she actually put the woman through the drywall. "Easy, Sarge. Let her go. She ain't worth the paperwork," Paulie muttered. Sarge let go with a disgusted shove, and Clara slumped back down onto the couch, trembling. Her Hollywood dignity entirely shattered into a million pieces. Just then, the telephone on Sarge's desk rang, breaking the heavy, suffocating silence of the room. I walked over and picked up the receiver. "Morgan," I barked into the mouthpiece. "Jack, it's Dogface," the gravelly voice came through the wire, accompanied by the background noise of a busy pool room. "We found him." Chapter 7. "Where is he?" I asked, gripping the receiver tight against my ear. "The baseline joint over on Santa Monica, near the tracks," Dogface's voice crackled through the wire. "He's sitting at the back table with a short glass and a cue he ain't using. He's alone, Jack." "Keep your eyes on him. We're on our way," I said, slamming the phone back into its cradle. I turned around and looked at the room. Sarge was still breathing heavy, her knuckles white, while Clara was busy rubbing her smarting cheek and looking at the floorboards like a whipped dog. Barbara hadn't moved an inch, her face a blank, numb mask. "Joe, stay here and keep a lid on this place," I ordered, adjusting my shoulder holster under my jacket. "Paulie, you're with me. Let's go see this monster." The drive down to Santa Monica Boulevard was done in a tense, engine-roaring silence. The afternoon smog was hanging thick over the asphalt, tasting like charcoal and exhaust. My hands were tight on the leather wheel of the DeSoto. I was still vibrating from the sight of those white, jagged scars on the kid's back, and right now I was looking for someone to break. The pool hall was a low-slung, windowless brick box that smelled of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and damp chalk. The green felt on the tables was stained and scorched with cigarette burns, and the only light came from low-hanging tin shades that kept the faces of the players in deep shadow. Dogface was leaning against a cigarette machine near the front, giving us a sharp, almost imperceptible nod toward the very back of the room. Polly and I walked down the narrow aisle, our leather heels clicking against the sawdust on the floor. Sitting at a small wooden table beneath a dead neon beer sign was Victor Elliott. He didn't look like a blackmailer. He didn't look like a psycho who cut up women in trailers or sent poisonous letters to movie stars. He looked like a guy who had been rode hard and put away wet by life. His canvas jacket was frayed at the cuffs, his hair was thinning, and his eyes were fixed on the amber liquid in his glass. I kicked the empty chair opposite him, drawing it out with a loud, scraping screech. I sat down, leaning my elbows on the sticky table, while Paulie planted his massive frame right behind Victor's shoulder, cutting off the light. Victor didn't jump. He just slowly raised his eyes, looking at me with a tired, hollow expression that had absolutely no fear in it. "You Jack Morgan?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. He didn't have a lick of an Arkansas drawl. He sounded like pure, unadulterated Los Angeles street. "Yeah," I said, keeping my hands flat on the table. "And you're the guy who's been making life miserable down at Metro." Victor let out a soft, dry chuckle that sounded like shifting gravel. He shook his head and took a small sip from his glass. "I haven't been within a mile of the Metro gates in 5 years, pal. I know what Claire's telling you. I know what she's telling the studio. But you're barking up the wrong tree." I leaned in closer, letting the shadow of my hat fall across his face. "She says you're threatening the kid, Vic. She says you sliced her arms open in her dressing room yesterday." Victor's hand clenched around his glass, the first real spark of emotion breaking through his tired face. "I'd cut my own throat before I ever hurt that kid," he hissed, his voice trembling with a sudden, raw intensity. "Claire's a parasite. She's been bleeding that girl dry since she dragged her out here from Arkansas. I know all about the drunken father getting hit by the train back home. Claire used to use that old ghost to guilt the kid into compliance before she even knew how to read a script." He took another slow drink, his eyes darkening as he remembered. "I stayed around as long as I could because I loved that little girl like she was my own flesh and blood. I wanted to give her a real life, a normal childhood away from Claire's madness. But the second Barbara started booking studio work and the real money started rolling in, Clara kicked me to the curb, said a grease monkey like me was bad for the image. She didn't want anyone around who knew what she really was." He leaned back, a bitter, exhausted smile crossing his lips. "I haven't sent a single note, pal. I just wanted to see her. Just wanted to tell her she didn't have to let that bitch kill her for a paycheck." Victor leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the sticky table. The tired, defeated look in his eyes suddenly vanished, replaced by a raw, burning disgust that made him look 10 years older. "You think the beatings are the worst part, Morgan?" he whispered, his voice dropping so low I had to lean in just to hear him over the click of the billiard balls across the room. "You don't know the half of it. After Clara kicked me out of the picture, and before she ever landed that big MGM contract, she got desperate." He stopped, swallowing hard, staring down into his amber glass like the memory itself was poisonous. "She was prostituting her own daughter," Victor said, the words cutting through the damp air of the pool hall like a jagged blade, "taking her to private parties, pushing her onto big-shot studio executives in hopes of buying her a career. Clara was trying to use their sick lust for underage girls as a setup, grooming the kid for the bedroom, then planning to use it as blackmail to force them into signing Barbara to a contract. The air in my lungs went completely stale. Behind me, I heard Paulie let out a low, breathy curse, his massive frame shifting as the sheer, stomach-turning weight of the news hit us both.
The executives got scared off, or they paid Claire off, or Mannix finally stepped in to bury the stench with a legitimate contract just to keep the industry from imploding, Victor continued, his hands trembling now.
But that's the real story, Morgan. That's the sacrifice Clara always brags about. She didn't build a star. She broke a little girl's soul and used the pieces as currency. I sat perfectly still, the blue tobacco smoke curling around my fedora. Every piece of the puzzle didn't just fit together. They locked into place with a sickening, heavy thud. The venomous notes, the ink smudges, the staged attack in the trailer. Clara wasn't trying to protect her daughter from an outside monster. She was the monster. And she was staging a phantom blackmailer to keep Barbara terrified, dependent, and isolated from anyone who might look too closely at the past. I slowly stood up from the table, my chair screeching against the sawdust floor, my mind already racing back to the agency office where Clara Tash was sitting on our leather couch. We left Victor at the back table of the pool hall and practically tore the doors off the DeSoto, getting back into the traffic. But we didn't head for the agency. Not yet. First, we needed a trip to Metro to find out exactly what Eddie Mannix wasn't telling us. When we reached the administration building, Paulie and I didn't bother waiting for an invitation. We bypassed the secretary out front, ignoring her protests as I threw open the heavy oak door to the inner office. Eddie was standing behind his massive desk, throwing some contracts into a leather briefcase, packing up for the night. He looked up, his sharp eyes instantly registering the raw, unadulterated fury on my face. "What aren't you telling me, Eddie?" I barked, slamming my hands flat on the desk, leaning in until we were eye to eye. What I know already makes me sick to my stomach. "Trust me, you don't want me pulling you over this desk." Mannix didn't flinch, but the iron-jawed studio fixer suddenly looked very old and very tired. He let out a long, heavy sigh that seemed to deflate his entire chest and gestured toward the leather armchairs. "Sit down, boys," he said quietly. Paulie and I sat, the air in the room turning dead cold. Eddie sank back into his executive chair, rubbed his temples, and laid it all out on the table. He confirmed every single word Victor had told us. The mother, the prostitution, the blackmail, all of it orchestrated by the one person who was supposed to be the kid's protector. When the rumors started hitting my desk, it made my blood run cold, Mannix admitted, staring at his hands. Clara was shopping that poor kid around to every degenerate with a studio title, trying to trap them. I couldn't let that filth ruin the industry, and more importantly, I couldn't let that monster destroy the kid any further. I stepped in and signed Barbara to a legitimate contract to keep her off the casting couch, and to try and keep the mother at bay with a steady stream of legal studio dough. He paused, a faint, genuine glimmer of pride breaking through his exhaustion. Luckily, the girl has talent, real talent. She didn't need any of her mother's sick schemes to be a star. Eddie closed his briefcase with a sharp click and looked up at me. "Where is she now?" "In my office," I replied, my voice flat. "With Joe and our secretary, Sarge, watching over them. That's assuming Sarge hasn't taken out the mother by the time we get back." Mannix let out a grim, humorless chuckle. "From what I've heard about your Sarge, that might be the best thing that could happen for the girl." He stood up, adjusting his tie. "By the way, when you get back, tell Barbara she starts a new picture on Monday, Chapter 8. "Can I use your phone, Eddie?" I asked, gesturing toward the heavy black receiver on his desk. Mannix simply nodded, sliding the telephone toward me as he strapped his leather briefcase shut. I dialed the baseline joint. When the bartender put him on, I didn't waste any breath. "Dogface," I barked into the mouthpiece. "Collect Victor. Bring him and Handsome straight down to the agency office. I want everybody in the same room." I slammed the receiver back onto its cradle and turned toward the door. Paulie was staring at me, his fedora tilted back on his head, his thick eyebrows knitted together in total confusion.
"What the hell are you doing, Jack?" Paulie asked, adjusting his shoulder holster as we hurried out to the corridor.
I gave him a grim, humorless smile as we hit the pavement. I want to give the old bitch one last chance to show off her acting skills. The drive back to the office was fast and silent. When we pulled up, Dogface's sedan was already idling by the curb. Victor and Handsome piled out of the doors, and the five of us met on the sidewalk, walking up the creaking wooden stairs together like an execution squad. The moment I threw open the glass door and set foot in the lobby, Clara looked up from the leather couch. The second her eyes landed on Victor, she went into absolute theatrical hysterics. "Why would you bring him here?" she screamed, her voice hitting a piercing, jagged note that rattled the window panes. She bolted to her feet, waving her bandaged arms wildly in the air. "He wants to kill her. Look at what he did to me. Look at my arms. Are you out of your minds?" But Barbara didn't look terrified. She looked up, her hollow eyes suddenly coming alive, a look of pure, overwhelming relief washing over her face. She didn't shrink back, she ran. She sprinted right past her mother, threw her arms tightly around Victor's neck, and buried her face in his frayed canvas jacket.
Victor held her just as tight, his weathered face cracking with a quiet, protective sorrow.
"Get away from him," Clara shrieked, lunging forward to grab Barbara's wrist. This was the moment. The room went dead silent, every eye in the house turning to me. I stepped right into the center of the floor, crossing my arms, letting the full weight of the room rest on my shoulders. It was time to have my Nick Charles moment. "Sit down, lady," I said, my voice dropping into a deadly, unyielding flat tone. Clara froze, looking at the sheer malice in my eyes, and slowly sank back onto the threadbare leather cushion, her chest heaving. I took a slow breath and looked around the room, taking my time, letting the tension coil tight enough to snap. "Let's lay the ledger out on the table," I began, my heels pacing a slow line across the linoleum floor. "We started this case looking for a shadow, a phantom who was sending vicious letters, smudging them with fresh black ink, just to keep a young movie star living in absolute terror. We were told it was a disgruntled ex-boyfriend, a hustler who couldn't handle being left behind." I stopped, looking directly at Clara.
But the pieces didn't fit. The timeline was sloppy. The defensive wounds on a certain pair of arms didn't stop someone from throwing a heavy, lightning-fast slap across her daughter's face right here in this office. And then we found Victor. We found out that Victor hasn't been within a mile of the Metro gates in 5 long years. We found out he loved that kid like his own flesh and blood and tried to shield her from the real sickness in her life. I leaned against the corner of Sarge's desk, my eyes narrowing. Then we paid a visit to Eddie Mannix. Eddie was more than happy to balance the books for us. He told us about the years before the MGM contract, about the private parties, about a mother who was prostituting her own underage daughter to studio executives trying to use their degenerate lust as a setup for blackmail to buy a career. He told us how he had to step in with a legitimate contract just to keep the industry from imploding and save the kid from the woman who was supposed to be her protector. The office went stone cold dead. Claire's face began to drain of color, her polished Miss Tash facade cracking right down the middle. The person responsible for the death threats, the psychological terror, and the cuts on Clara's arms is standing in this very room, I said, letting the words hang in the damp air. Clara tried to rally, pointing a trembling, manicured finger across the room at the man holding her daughter. "Of course he is! He's right there! I told you it was him! He's the monster!" I barked, taking 2 sharp steps forward until I was crowding her air, looking down at the ugly reality of her face. "You overplayed your hand, Miss Hawkswell. The person responsible for the threats, the glass, and the terror is the person you see in the mirror."
Claire's hand dived into her handbag, and before anyone could blink, the polished nickel of a small frame pistol flashed under the office lights. "I'll kill you all. I'll kill every last one of you," she said. Her voice didn't shake. The theatrical trembling, the tears, the frantic hysterics, it all vanished in a split second, replaced by the flat, dead stare of a cornered timber wolf. "You don't have enough bullets, lady," Dogface rumbled from the corner. His hand was already buried inside his overcoat, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous growl. For a long, agonizing second, nobody made a move. The air in the room turned to pure concrete, and I could hear the rhythmic hum of the ceiling fan cutting through the silence. My eyes were locked on her trigger finger. I kept my hands loose at my sides, inches from my Colt, waiting for the slight shift in her weight that meant she was going to squeeze. She dropped her eyes for a fraction of a second, glancing toward the exit. And that was all the invitation we needed. The room erupted in a sudden symphony of leather slaps and metal clicks. In a heartbeat, Paulie, Dogface, Handsome, and I all had our pieces out, a half-dozen barrels instantly tracking onto the center of her chest. Joe didn't pull his snub nose. Instead, he took a half-step forward, raising his hands, his voice steady with the last shred of his old investigator's calm. "It doesn't have to end like this, Clara." But Clara was entirely gone past the point of reason. With a desperate, feral shriek, she lunged sideways, her fingers clawing into the collar of Barbara's blouse. She yanked the girl backward against her chest, using her own daughter as a shield, and pressed the cold muzzle of the nickel-plated pistol hard against the kid's temple. "I did everything for her. She owes me. I am her fucking mother," she screamed. Her face contorted into an ugly, veins-popping mask of pure mania, her spit flying across the desk. Tears started flowing from Barbara's eyes, cutting hot tracks through the heavy studio powder on her cheeks. She didn't fight back. She just shook, completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization of what her mother truly was. But the sight of her daughter's heartbreak didn't make Clara hesitate for a single second. Her knuckles only went whiter around the grip. "If I can't have her, nobody will." Clara's thumb hooked over the hammer of the pistol, pulling it back. The sharp mechanical click echoed like a thunderclap in the small room. Bang! The gunshot exploded within the four walls of the office. A deafening roar that slammed against my eardrums and left a sharp ringing in its wake. Blue cordite smoke instantly bit the air. I braced my feet to take the shot, but Clara's eyes were already going wide, staring blankly at the ceiling as the life evaporated from them. Her grip loosened, her knees giving out, and she dropped heavily onto the linoleum floor. The nickel-plated pistol slipped from her fingers, clattering against the floorboards and sliding out of sight beneath the leather couch. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room, thick with the smell of burnt gunpowder. I stood perfectly frozen, my Colt still raised, looking around the room through the haze to see who had beaten me to the draw. Paulie was staring open-mouthed, his gun lowered by an inch. Dogface and Handsome hadn't fired either. Across the room, the smoke was clearing around Sarge's desk. With a face like absolute granite, she casually dropped a heavy, smoking revolver back into her top drawer. She slid it shut with a quiet, decisive click and sat back down in her chair. She didn't say a word, didn't check for a pulse, and didn't offer an excuse. She just pulled her desk ledger back toward her, picked up her fountain pen, and went right back to logging the agency accounts. Barbara didn't look down at the floor. She couldn't. She sprinted across the room, her high heels tripping over themselves, and threw herself into Victor's arms. She buried her face deep into his frayed canvas jacket, sobbing violently, shielding her eyes entirely from the sight of her mother dead on the floor and the dark, thick pool of blood slowly forming under her head. I let out a long breath I felt like I'd been holding since Tuesday, decocked my Colt, and slid it back into the leather under my arm. The phantom blackmailer was gone, But the cleanup was going to be a hell of a lot worse than the case. Chapter 9. The smoke was still hanging heavy under the ceiling fan when I picked up the receiver and dialed the direct line back to Metro. I didn't say much. Just that the problem in our office had been permanently resolved and the bill was due. True to his word, Eddie Mannix didn't arrive alone.
Within 20 minutes, a closed panel delivery truck pulled into the alley behind the building.
Mannix walked up the stairs ahead of two tight-lipped men carrying heavy canvas bags and a crate of industrial cleaning supplies. The studio fixer didn't even look at the floor. He just walked straight over to Sarge's desk, pulled out a thick envelope of cash, and dropped it onto her ledger with a heavy thud. "The agency is paid in full, Jack," Mannix said, his voice flat and professional. "As for the story, Clara Tash was a deeply disturbed woman, strung out on the pressure of her daughter's success. She had a sudden, tragic nervous breakdown right here in your office, pulled a registered firearm, and took her own life before any of you could stop her. The Morgan and Russo agency did everything they could to save her." He looked over at Barbara, who was still holding tightly to Victor. "The press will buy it because I'm paying them to buy it. MGM protects its own." The cleanup crew went to work with terrifying silent efficiency. By the time they walked out, the blood was gone, the nickel-plated pistol was in Mannix's pocket, and the room smelled of nothing but pine oil and bleach.
Victor took Barbara out the back door, promising to keep her safe at his place until the weekend was over.
Before she left, Barbara turned back to look at us. The tear tracks were still visible on her face, but for the first time, her eyes looked clear. "Jack, Polly, please, come to the lot on Monday. Just for the first couple of scenes. I don't think I can walk onto that stage alone." I looked at the boys. Polly shrugged and Joe gave a slow nod. "We'll be there, kid," I said. Monday morning at Metro Goldwyn Mayer was a completely different world. When we walked onto stage 4, the tension that usually choked the air was entirely gone.
We stood by the rigging, watching the lights come up on a simulated New York street corner. When Barbara stepped out of her trailer, my jaw nearly hit the sawdust floor. She was an absolutely different person than the hysterical, broken girl we had met. She wasn't screaming at the wardrobe girls. She wasn't throwing compacts at the makeup artists. She was laughing. She was joking with the prop master, teasing the camera operator, and flashing a genuine, radiant smile that didn't have a lick of Hollywood phony in it. Without Clara pulling her strings from the shadows, she was just a remarkably talented young woman who genuinely loved the craft of acting. "Look at that," Polly muttered, leaning against a packing crate. "The kid's actually got a smile that don't look like it was painted on by a mortician." "She's free, Polly," Joe said quietly, lighting a cigarette. "That's what freedom looks like." Before we could enjoy the view for too long, the director, a frantic little man with a megaphone and a silk scarf, came storming over to our corner, pointing a manicured finger right at the three of us. You 3 big gorillas!" he barked. "I need bodies for the background of the speakeasy scene. The central casting boys didn't show up, and you 3 have the exact, authentic, ugly mugs I need. Go with the wardrobe girl, right now." "Who are you calling ugly, pal?" Polly snapped, stepping forward, but I caught him by the shoulder. "Hold on, Polly," I grinned, a wicked thought crossing my mind. "Let's see what the studio's got to offer." 10 minutes later, we were crammed into a tiny, brightly lit makeup trailer, and the nightmare truly began. A woman named Beatrice was currently slathering a thick, cold orange paste over my jawline with a sponge. "Hey, watch the eyes, sister," I grumbled, wincing as she dabbed a heavy layer of powder over my nose. "I'm a private investigator, not a circus clown." "Shut up and stop squirming, Morgan," Polly groaned from the chair next to me. He looked like an absolute disaster. They had forced him into a loud, pinstriped visual abomination of a suit that looked 3 sizes too small, and a wardrobe assistant was currently trying to squeeze a stiff, celluloid collar around his thick neck. "Look at me! I look like a high society pimp." If Veronica sees me in this, she's going to laugh me right out of the bedroom. You look beautiful, Polly, Joe called out from the back corner. Joe had gotten the worst of it. They had decided he was playing a high-class gentleman, which meant he was currently wearing a velvet-collared coat and a silk top hat that sat precariously on his head. Though I think your corset might be a little tight. Keep laughing, Joe, Polly growled, struggling to turn his head. The second we get out on that stage, I'm accidentally tripping you right into the orchestra pit. Nobody is tripping anyone, I said, squinting through the layer of heavy pancake makeup that made my face feel like dried mud. We sit at the background table, we look tough, we collect our background actor voucher, and then we go straight to Rose's for a gallon of coffee to wash the taste of this powder out of our mouths. The trailer door flew open, and Barbara looked in, wearing a stunning 1920s flapper dress. She took one look at the three of us, orange-faced, stuffed into vintage threads, and looking thoroughly miserable, and let out a loud, beautiful belly laugh that filled the entire lot. You boys look absolutely wonderful, she beamed. My heroes. I adjusted the brim of my fedora, which was the only thing they hadn't changed, and gave her a slow nod. Just remember to hit your marks, kid. We don't do second takes. Just make sure we don't have to wear the orange paint to the theater, Polly muttered, already tearing at the suffocating celluloid collar the second the director shouted, "Cut!" The scene had gone off without a hitch. We sat at that background table, looked sufficiently thuggish, and watched Barbara absolutely command the room under the blazing studio lights. Watching her perform without the invisible handcuffs her mother had kept on her for years was worth every bit of the itchy makeup. As the crew began resetting the stage for the next setup, we walked Barbara back toward her canvas chair. The heavy dark cloud that had followed her into the Morgan and Russo detective agency last week was officially gone. She stopped, looking up at the three of us, her eyes bright and genuinely grateful. "I'll make sure you get tickets to the premiere," she said, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across her face. I adjusted the brim of my fedora, finally feeling like myself again, as the studio glamour faded into the background. "If you insist, kid," I said. Joe gave her a polite, gentlemanly nod with his silk top hat, and Polly just grinned, rubbing his neck. "Just tell him to put us near the back, Barbara. We're better in the shadows anyway." We turned and walked off stage 4, leaving the bright lights and the phony New York streets behind us. By the time we hit the pavement outside the metro gates, the Los Angeles sun was beating down, tasting of asphalt and exhaust. It was a dirty, cynical town, and it was always going to find a way to bleed people dry. But today, at least, one kid was walking away with her soul intact. I fished the keys to the DeSoto out of my pocket and looked at the boys, the orange pancake makeup still sticking to our jaws. "Come on," I said, throwing open the driver's side door. "Let's go find some real coffee. Not a word of this to anyone. Not even our wives," I said, leaning over the steering wheel of the DeSoto, as I navigated the traffic outside the studio gates. "This is just ammunition for Rose and Sarge to say we've gone Hollywood." "My lips are sealed, Jack," Paulie groaned, still vigorously rubbing his sleeve against his neck to get the last of the sticky wardrobe collar chafing off. "Mainly because if Veronica finds out I wore velvet, I'll never hear the end of it." We drove off the lot and headed straight for the diner, the morning sun finally burning through the heavy LA smog. We needed grease, we needed caffeine, and we needed to feel like regular working stiffs again. But the second I threw open the diner door, the illusion shattered. From the back corner, Big Mike caught sight of us, raised a thick mug, and let out a big, booming voice that yelled out, "Hey, Hollywood!" Paulie's shoulders slumped instantly. "News sure does travel fast in this town," he grumbled, pulling his fedora down to hide his orange ears. Behind the counter, Rose caught us walking in. She wiped her hands on her apron, a brilliant, teasing smirk dancing on her lips. "I'm glad to see you, boys," she said, her voice dripping with mock relief. "I was afraid they hired you to be the new Keystone Cops." "Very funny, dear," I said, walking up and planting a quick, apologetic kiss on her cheek. "Steak, eggs, and coffee all around. MGM is paying for it." "In that case, make the steaks double thick," Paulie cheered. sliding into our usual big booth. We had barely settled into the cracked vinyl when the little bell above the door chimed again. Dogface, Handsome, and Sarge walked in together, looking tired but clear-eyed. The smoke had finally cleared, and the paperwork was filed. Joe looked up from the booth and caught Rose's eye. "Put them on our ticket," he said, gesturing to the three of us. They slid into the neighboring booth, and with the whole crew back in one place, the heavy weight of the last week finally began to lift. The jokes and banter naturally started flowing over the clatter of thick ceramic mugs and sizzling grease. I leaned across the table, fixing Polly with a grin. "So, Polly, did you ever give the mother-in-law that big kiss?" Polly didn't even look up from his coffee. No, her fangs got in the way. Across the aisle, Dogface wrapped his massive hands around his mug and looked over at me. "By the way, Jack, Victor says thank you. He said if you or the agency ever need a favor from him, just call." "I don't know what it would be," I said, shaking my head with a slight smile, "but it's always good to have some help from time to time." Handsome leaned forward, a wicked glint in his eye, as he looked at Polly. "How does the mother-in-law like the apartment anyway?" "She says it has a draft," Polly snapped, shaking his head. "I'm starting that moat tomorrow. Dogface, Handsome, I'm sure you two have plenty of practice digging holes." A roar of laughter went up around the tables, but as the guys kept trading jabs, I noticed Sarge sitting quiet at the far end of the counter. She was just staring into her black coffee, her face still carrying that heavy, unyielding granite look. But her shoulders were pinned tight. I slid out of the booth, walked over to the counter, and took the stool right next to her. I waited a beat, letting the noise of the diner fade into the background. "You okay, kid?" I asked quietly. She didn't look at me right away. She just turned her mug in a slow, precise circle on the laminate. "Not really," she said, her voice dropping down to a raspy whisper. "But it was what I had to do." I reached out, putting a heavy, steady hand on her shoulder, letting her know she wasn't standing alone in that smoke-filled room anymore. "Sometimes that is all we can do, Sarge." She took a long breath, the tension in her jaw loosening just a fraction, and finally looked up at me. "How did the morning go at the studio?" At the sound of the question, the conversation at the booths died instantly. Jack, Joe, and Polly, all of us simultaneously trying to scrub at the faint, stubborn streaks of orange pancake makeup we couldn't quite get off our jawlines, looked at each other and barked in perfect unison. "We don't want to talk about it!" Chapter 10. We managed to keep our mouths shut for months. Through the sweltering LA summer, through a dozen other routine divorce and insurance cases, not a single word about Stage 4 slipped out. It was a matter of professional survival. When the gold embossed tickets arrived at the Morgan and Russo Detective Agency, we didn't have much of a choice. We got dressed up, though Polly made a point of checking his collar 3 times to ensure it looked okay. True to her word, Barbara had scored us an entire row right in the back of the Grand Movie Palace, away from the flashing bulbs of the paparazzi and the blinding lights choking the boulevard. We sat there like a row of crows in our best suits. I had Rose on my arm, Polly was wedged between Veronica and her mother, and Joe, Sarge, Dogface, and Handsome filled out the rest of the line. The theater went dark, and the program started. We sat through a melodrama prologue, a newsreel about the war recovery, a travelogue short, and a Tom and Jerry cartoon that had Polly chuckling into his popcorn. Then, the screen went black. The iconic Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer lion roared, its golden frame filling the screen, and a moment later, Barbara's name flashed in giant glowing letters. The movie was good. Really good. Without Clara's shadow hanging over her, the kid absolutely owned the screen, her performance commanding the entire theater. Then, 20 minutes in, the music shifted to a smoky jazz rhythm, and the setting transitioned to a crowded, low-lit 1920s speakeasy. The camera began a slow, sweeping pan around the smoke-filled room, tracking a slick-looking mobster walking toward the bar. As the lens drifted past the small round table in the deep background, it caught 3 figures,
Sitting under a haze of prop cigarette smoke, there we were, celluloid giants. Jack, Joe, and Polly, sporting heavy coats, scowling like a trio of orange-faced cutthroats, looking thoroughly miserable and entirely authentic. Beside me, Rose's jaw dropped. She froze, staring at the screen in absolute shock, before her hand shot out and squeezed my fingers tight enough to cut off the circulation. I just gave her a sheepish, sideways grin. A few seats down, Joe instantly lost all his posture, slumping down so low in his velvet chair that his chin nearly hit his collar. Sarge didn't even blink. With a face like absolute granite, she delivered a sharp, lightning-fast elbow straight into his ribs, forcing him to sit back up straight and take his medicine. Dogface just stared at the screen, his heavy brow furrowing in total confusion as he tried to cross-reference the tough guys on the silver screen with the guys he shared a diner booth with every morning. Handsome leaned past him, shaking his head in mock disappointment.
"You should have called me," he whispered loudly. "I look way better in a fedora than Morgan." But it was Polly who was suffering the most. He sat perfectly still, holding his breath, desperately hoping for a shred of positive feedback from his family. He didn't get it. His mother-in-law squinted through the dark theater at his giant pinstripe background frame, leaned across Veronica, and let out a loud, judgmental huff. "I know they say the camera adds 10 pounds, she sighed, her voice cutting right through the movie's dialogue, but geez. Polly's shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands. I had to bite the inside of my cheek until it bled to keep from laughing out loud right there in the dark. The house lights came up, flooding the grand auditorium with a warm golden glow and shattering the dark magic of the silver screen. Around us, the high society crowd erupted into a thunderous standing ovation, applause echoing off the ornate velvet walls. Before Polly could even attempt to defend his on-screen weight to his mother-in-law, a commotion started near the front of the theater. The sea of tuxedos and silk gowns parted, and Barbara came walking straight up the center aisle. She was flanked by studio executives and publicists, but the second her eyes landed on our row in the very back, she blew right past the velvet ropes and the flashing cameras of the press. She walked straight up to us, her eyes sparkling with genuine joy. She gave Joe and Polly tight hugs, then turned to me, wrapping her arms around my neck. "You are wonderful," she whispered fiercely. "All of you. Thank you for being here." "You kicked its teeth in, kid," I said, giving her a gentle pat on the shoulder. "Now go on back down there. That crowd is paying to see a fucking star." She flashed one last, brilliant smile, a real one, and let herself be pulled back into the glittering vortex of Hollywood royalty. "All right," I muttered, looking at Joe and Polly as the crowd's attention shifted back to the front. "Let's make our break before the mother-in-law figures out a way to blame Polly for the seating arrangements." We didn't wait for the credits to finish rolling. We slipped out the side exit into the cool, crisp California night, leaving the glamour, the applause, and the phoniness behind us. The whole crew piled into the cars, and a minute later, I was pumping the gas pedal, bringing the DeSoto's engine to life with a familiar, throaty rumble. I pulled out into the neon-soaked traffic of Sunset Boulevard, the tires humming against the asphalt. I rolled the window down an inch, letting the cool evening air whip inside to chase away the smell of movie theater popcorn, and pulled a cigarette from my pack, striking a match with my thumb. Beside me, Rose leaned her head against my shoulder, her hand resting over mine on the seat. In the rearview mirror, Paulie was already resting his arm on the doorframe, his fedora tilted back, completely at peace now that he was back in the shadows where he belonged. Hollywood is a town built on beautiful illusions, painted faces, and expensive lies cooked up by guys like Eddie Mannix to keep the rubes buying tickets. Most times, the monsters in this city get to hide behind a studio contract and $1 million smile. But every once in a while, if you look close enough in the dark, the good guys get to write the ending. I took a long drag of the cigarette,
watching the smoke drift out into the night air, and pressed my foot down on the accelerator, steering the DeSoto deeper into the neon heart of Los Angeles.